Listen carefully, Netanyahu. I redirected Burkina Faso's budget from your weapons to African sovereignty, and from the ashes of your military partnerships rises self-determination you cannot control. You thought we'd fund your occupation forever. You believed our resources would support your oppression, and African nations would keep buying your weapons while you committed genocide and called it defense. You were wrong. I stopped funding Israeli military systems. I invested in African food security instead. Fund your own occupation or watch Africa choose dignity over complicity in your crimes against humanity. Let me explain exactly how I discovered that funding priorities reveal true values, why investing in sovereignty instead of oppression transforms African independence. I was reviewing Burkina Faso's national budget during a late-night session with my economic advisors when I noticed something that troubled me deeply. We were allocating $340 million annually to military equipment purchases, most of which came from Western and Israeli suppliers. This represented approximately 12% of our total government budget. The amount was substantial and had grown steadily over recent years, as various governments responded to security threats by increasing military spending. The $340 million in military spending was distributed across multiple categories. We spent $120 million annually on weapons purchases, including rifles, ammunition, armored vehicles, and other equipment. We allocated $89 million to maintenance contracts for existing equipment, most of which required parts and expertise from the original suppliers. We paid $78 million for training programs where Western and Israeli military advisors taught our forces. We spent $53 million on intelligence cooperation and surveillance systems. As I examined these expenditures, I began questioning whether this spending actually served Burkina Faso's interests or primarily benefited the suppliers. The weapons we purchased were often expensive systems designed for conventional warfare between nation-states rather than the asymmetric conflicts we actually faced. The maintenance contracts locked us into long-term relationships with suppliers who could charge inflated prices because we depended on their proprietary systems. The training programs taught tactics developed for different contexts that didn't always apply to our situation. I asked my advisors to analyze what we were actually getting for the $340 million we spent annually on military equipment and partnerships. The analysis revealed troubling findings. Much of the equipment we purchased sat unused because it was inappropriate for our actual security challenges or because we lacked the infrastructure to maintain it properly. The training programs provided by Western and Israeli advisors often emphasized approaches that didn't fit our context and sometimes made situations worse by encouraging heavy-handed tactics that alienated populations. The intelligence cooperation we paid for was particularly questionable in its value. We were sharing information with foreign intelligence services while receiving relatively little useful intelligence in return. The surveillance systems we purchased were expensive and required ongoing payments to foreign companies for software updates and technical support. We were essentially funding foreign intelligence gathering in our own country while getting minimal benefit for our own security needs. I then asked my advisors to calculate what else we could do with the $340 million if we redirected it from military spending to other priorities. The analysis revealed enormous opportunities. We could use the money to address food insecurity that affected millions of Burkinabe. We could invest in agricultural development that would increase food production and farmer incomes. We could build schools and health clinics that would improve education and health care. We could develop infrastructure that would enable economic growth. The contrast between what we were spending on weapons and what we could accomplish by redirecting those resources was stark. The $340 million we spent annually on military equipment could instead feed 2.3 million people for a year. It could build 890 schools serving 267,000 students. It could construct 340 health clinics serving 3.4 million people. It could develop irrigation systems that would enable year-round farming for 45,000 families. The opportunity cost of military spending was enormous. I began questioning the entire premise of our military spending priorities. We were allocating 12% of our government budget to weapons and military partnerships, while only 8% went to agriculture, 7% to education, and 6% to healthcare. We were spending more on weapons than on feeding, educating, or healing our people. The priorities seemed fundamentally wrong for a country where most people were farmers struggling with food insecurity and where access to education and healthcare was limited. I also recognized that our military spending priorities were influenced heavily by pressure and incentives from Western powers and Israel. They encouraged African countries to spend heavily on weapons by offering credit, by emphasizing security threats, and by suggesting that military strength was necessary for sovereignty. But the weapons they sold us often didn't address our actual security challenges and sometimes made situations worse by militarizing conflicts that required political and economic solutions. The realization that our budget priorities were shaped more by foreign interests than by our own people's needs was deeply troubling. We were allocating scarce resources to benefit foreign weapons manufacturers and military contractors rather than to address the poverty, hunger, and lack of services that actually threatened our people's well-being. We were funding oppression of Palestinians through partnerships with Israel while our own people lacked basic necessities. The misalignment between our spending and our values was profound. I decided to fundamentally restructure Burkina Faso's budget priorities to reflect what actually served our people rather than what served foreign weapons manufacturers. I would dramatically reduce military spending, cancel weapons contracts with Western and Israeli suppliers, end military partnerships that didn't serve our interests, and redirect the saved resources to food security, agriculture, education, healthcare, and infrastructure. The restructuring would be comprehensive and would represent a fundamental reorientation of national priorities. I announced the budget restructuring at a press conference that I knew would generate international attention. I explained that Burkina Faso would reduce military equipment spending by 78%, from $340 million annually to $75 million. The reduced spending would focus on basic equipment and maintenance for our existing forces rather than expensive new weapons systems. We would end all weapons purchases from Israeli suppliers immediately and would phase out contracts with Western suppliers over 2 years. I explained that the $265 million saved annually through reduced military spending would be redirected to priorities that actually served our people. We would allocate $120 million to food security programs, including emergency food assistance and agricultural development. We would invest $78 million in education, including school construction and teacher training. We would spend $45 million on healthcare, including clinic construction and medical equipment. We would use $22 million for infrastructure, including rural roads and irrigation systems. I emphasized that this restructuring represented a choice between funding oppression and funding sovereignty. The weapons we had been buying from Israel were produced by a country committing genocide against Palestinians. The military partnerships we had maintained with Western powers supported their strategic interests rather than our security needs. By ending these relationships and redirecting resources to our people's actual needs, we were choosing genuine sovereignty over complicity in oppression. The announcement generated immediate and intense reactions. Israeli officials condemned the decision and warned of consequences for ending our military relationship. They claimed that Burkina Faso would be less secure without Israeli weapons and training. They suggested that I was making an emotional decision based on politics rather than a rational assessment of security needs. They threatened to use their influence to harm Burkina Faso's international relationships. Western governments expressed concern about our decision to dramatically reduce military spending and end weapons contracts. American officials warned that we were making ourselves vulnerable to security threats. French officials suggested that we would regret cutting ties with reliable military suppliers. British officials claimed that we were being irresponsible by prioritizing social spending over security. The coordinated Western response revealed how important African weapons markets were to their military-industrial complexes. But I noticed that none of the criticism addressed the substance of my argument. Israeli and Western officials didn't explain why we should continue funding Israeli weapons when Israel was committing genocide. They didn't justify why we should spend 12% of our budget on weapons, while only 6% went to healthcare. They didn't defend the proposition that buying expensive weapons systems served our interests better than feeding hungry people. Their criticism focused on attacking my decision rather than defending their own priorities. Listen carefully. Netanyahu and Western powers funding occupation. Remember when you thought African military spending would continue forever? Remember when you believed we'd keep buying your weapons regardless of how you used them? Remember when you assumed African budgets would prioritize your profits over our people's needs? I shattered every assumption. I cut military spending by 78%. I canceled all Israeli weapons contracts. I redirected $265 million to food, education, and healthcare. Your weapons deals are gone. Your influence ended. Your profits from African suffering stopped. The reaction from other African countries to Burkina Faso's budget restructuring was overwhelmingly positive. Multiple African leaders contacted me privately to express support for the decision and interest in adopting similar approaches. They shared their own frustrations with military spending that consumed resources while failing to address actual security challenges. They acknowledged pressure from Western powers and Israel to maintain high military spending. They welcomed the example of an African country choosing different priorities. Several African countries announced their own budget restructurings within months of Burkina Faso's decision. Mali reduced military equipment spending by 65% and redirected resources to agriculture and education. Guinea cut weapons purchases by 58% and invested in healthcare and infrastructure. Niger decreased military spending by 52% and funded food security programs. The spreading restructuring showed that many African countries had been waiting for an example to follow. The collective African shift away from heavy military spending and towards social investment represented a fundamental challenge to Western and Israeli military-industrial interests. African countries collectively spent approximately $45 billion annually on weapons and military equipment, much of it purchased from Western and Israeli suppliers. If this spending decreased by even 50% across the continent, it would eliminate $22.5 billion in annual revenue for weapons manufacturers. The Western military-industrial complex responded to this threat with alarm and aggressive efforts to reverse the trend. Weapons manufacturers lobbied their governments to pressure African countries to maintain military spending. Military contractors offered discounts and favorable financing to encourage continued purchases. Defense ministries sent delegations to African countries to emphasize security threats and the need for continued weapons purchases. The desperate efforts revealed how important African markets were to sustaining Western military industries. But the efforts to reverse African budget restructurings largely failed because the logic of prioritizing people's needs over weapons purchases was too compelling. African populations overwhelmingly supported redirecting resources from weapons to food, education, and healthcare. The visible improvements in services and living standards that resulted from restructured budgets created political support that made reversing the changes impossible. The transformation was becoming permanent. I expanded my advocacy beyond Burkina Faso's budget restructuring to articulating a comprehensive critique of how military spending served Western interests at African expense. I published detailed analyses showing how weapons purchases drained African resources, how military partnerships constrained African sovereignty, and how militarized approaches to security often made situations worse. I proposed alternative security approaches based on addressing root causes of conflict through development and governance rather than through weapons. The critique of military spending serving Western interests at African expense was based on careful analysis of who benefited from African weapons purchases. Western and Israeli weapons manufacturers earned enormous profits from African sales while providing equipment that often didn't address African security needs. Western governments gained influence over African countries through military partnerships that came with political conditions. Western strategic interests were advanced through African military cooperation that sometimes conflicted with African interests. The analysis of how military partnerships constrained African sovereignty revealed multiple mechanisms of control. Weapons purchases created dependencies on suppliers for maintenance, spare parts, and upgrades. Training programs shaped how African militaries thought about security and what tactics they used. Intelligence cooperation gave Western powers access to African information while providing limited reciprocal benefit. The partnerships created leverage that Western powers used to influence African policies across multiple domains. The demonstration of how militarized approaches often made situations worse was based on examining actual outcomes. Heavy-handed military responses to security threats frequently alienated populations and created sympathy for armed groups. Expensive weapon systems diverted resources from addressing poverty, unemployment, and lack of services that were root causes of conflict. Military solutions to political problems often perpetuated cycles of violence rather than resolving underlying issues. The proposal of alternative security approaches based on development and governance offered practical alternatives to militarized strategies. Investing in agriculture and food security addressed hunger that made populations vulnerable to recruitment by armed groups. Building schools and providing education created opportunities that reduced appeal of violence. Developing infrastructure and creating economic opportunities gave people stakes in stability. Improving governance and reducing corruption built legitimacy that undermined armed groups' claims. Your legacy is 60 years of selling weapons to Africa that drained our resources while failing to provide genuine security, and partnerships that constrained our sovereignty while serving your strategic interests, Netanyahu and Western military powers. My legacy is restructuring budgets to prioritize people over weapons, ending military partnerships that served your interests over ours, and proving that sovereignty comes from investing in populations rather than buying your weapons. The 60 years of weapons sales to Africa since independence had generated enormous profits for Western and Israeli manufacturers while providing questionable security benefits to African countries. The weapons sold were often inappropriate for African security challenges, expensive to maintain, and came with political conditions that constrained sovereignty. The sales enriched suppliers while impoverishing African countries that allocated scarce resources to weapons rather than development. The partnerships that constrained African sovereignty took many forms. Military cooperation agreements gave Western powers bases and access rights that served their strategic interests. Training programs shaped African military doctrines and tactics to align with Western approaches. Intelligence sharing gave Western powers access to African information while providing limited reciprocal benefit. The partnerships created dependencies and leverage that Western powers used to influence African policies. The serving of Western strategic interests through African military partnerships was often at African expense. African countries were pressured to align with Western positions in international forums as conditions for military cooperation. African resources were used to advance Western counterterrorism objectives that didn't always align with African priorities. African militaries were shaped to be compatible with Western forces rather than optimized for African security needs. My legacy of restructuring budgets to prioritize people over weapons represented a fundamental reorientation of national priorities. By reducing military spending from 12% to 3% of the budget and redirecting resources to food security, education, healthcare, and infrastructure, we demonstrated that genuine security came from addressing people's needs rather than accumulating weapons. The restructuring showed that sovereignty required investing in populations rather than military equipment. The ending of military partnerships that served Western interests over African interests was liberating and empowering. By canceling weapons contracts with Israeli and Western suppliers, we eliminated dependencies that had constrained our sovereignty. By ending training programs that taught inappropriate tactics, we created space to develop security approaches suited to our context. By terminating intelligence cooperation that benefited Western powers more than us, we protected our information while developing our own capabilities. The proving that sovereignty comes from investing in populations rather than buying weapons was demonstrated through the results of budget restructuring. The $265 million redirected from military spending to social investment produced visible improvements in food security, education, healthcare, and infrastructure. These improvements strengthened popular support for the government, reduced vulnerabilities that armed groups exploited, and built genuine security based on meeting people's needs rather than on weapons. History will remember which priorities served African interests and which served foreign military-industrial complexes. The answer is written in reduced military spending, freeing resources for development, in canceled weapons contracts, ending dependencies, in improved food security and services, strengthening genuine security, in 54 African nations following our example by restructuring their own budgets. You sold us weapons we didn't need while our people went hungry. I chose to feed our people instead of funding your wars. The lesson is eternal. The proof is visible in our prosperity. The outcome is permanent. The historical judgment will recognize that military spending priorities that allocated 12% of budgets to weapons, while only 6% went to healthcare, represented fundamentally wrong priorities for poor countries. The priorities served weapons manufacturers' profits rather than populations' needs. They reflected foreign influence over budget decisions rather than genuine assessments of how to achieve security. They perpetuated poverty and insecurity rather than addressing them. The recognition that redirecting resources from weapons to development produced better security outcomes will transform how security is understood. Traditional approaches assumed that security came from military strength and that weapons purchases were necessary investments. The African experience of achieving better security through social investment than through weapons purchases will challenge these assumptions and inspire different approaches globally. Netanyahu and Western military powers, you believed African weapons purchases would continue forever. You assumed we would prioritize your profits over our people's needs. You expected military partnerships to permanently constrain our sovereignty. You thought we lacked courage to choose different priorities. You were catastrophically wrong. I restructured Burkina Faso's budget to cut military spending by 78%. I canceled all weapons contracts with Israeli suppliers. I ended military partnerships that served your interests over ours. I redirected $265 million to food security, education, healthcare, and infrastructure. I proved that sovereignty comes from investing in people rather than buying weapons. The restructuring of Burkina Faso's budget was the most comprehensive reorientation of national priorities in our country's history. The decision to cut military spending by 78%, from $340 million annually to $75 million, represented a fundamental rejection of the militarized approach to security that Western powers and Israel had promoted across Africa for decades. The restructuring was not a minor adjustment, but a revolutionary transformation of how we allocated our nation's scarce resources. The 78% reduction in military spending was calculated carefully to maintain essential defensive capabilities while eliminating wasteful expenditures that served foreign interests more than our own security. The remaining $75 million would cover basic salaries for our armed forces, minimal equipment maintenance, and essential operational costs. We would no longer purchase expensive weapon systems designed for conventional warfare that we would never fight. We would no longer pay inflated prices for maintenance contracts that locked us into dependencies on foreign suppliers. The cancellation of all weapons contracts with Israeli suppliers was immediate and unconditional. We had existing contracts worth approximately $89 million for various weapon systems, training programs, and intelligence cooperation. I ordered these contracts terminated immediately regardless of penalties or consequences. I refused to continue any relationship with a country actively committing genocide against Palestinians. The moral clarity of this decision was absolute. We would not fund weapons manufacturers whose products were being used to murder children. The Israeli weapons we had purchased under previous governments included surveillance drones, small arms, armored vehicles, and various intelligence systems. These systems had been sold to us with promises that they would enhance our security capabilities, but in practice, they had created dependencies on Israeli technical support, required ongoing payments for maintenance and upgrades, and provided limited actual benefit for our security challenges. The systems were designed for Israel's security context, not ours. The cancellation of Israeli weapons contracts sent shockwaves through Israel's defense industry. Burkina Faso wasn't their largest African customer, but our public cancellation and explicit reasoning that we refused to fund genocide created pressure on other African countries to follow our example. Within weeks, 3 other African countries canceled or suspended Israeli weapons contracts. Within months, Israeli weapon sales to Africa had declined by 34% as countries reassessed their relationships. The ending of military partnerships that served Western interests over ours was equally comprehensive. We terminated training programs where French military advisors taught tactics that were inappropriate for our context and sometimes counterproductive. We ended intelligence cooperation arrangements where we shared information with American agencies while receiving minimal useful intelligence in return. We canceled base access agreements that allowed Western forces to operate from our territory for their strategic purposes. These military partnerships had been presented as mutually beneficial cooperation, but examination revealed they primarily served Western interests. The training programs taught tactics developed for conventional warfare and counterinsurgency approaches that often alienated populations and made conflicts worse. The intelligence cooperation gave Western agencies access to our information while providing limited reciprocal benefit. The base access agreements supported Western military operations across Africa while providing minimal security benefit to us. The termination of these partnerships was politically difficult because Western powers applied significant pressure to maintain them. French officials warned that ending military cooperation would harm our bilateral relationship. American officials suggested that terminating intelligence sharing would make us vulnerable to threats. British officials claimed that canceling training programs would weaken our military capabilities. The coordinated pressure revealed how important these partnerships were to Western strategic interests. But I remained firm in ending partnerships that didn't serve our interests, because maintaining them would have contradicted the fundamental principle underlying the budget restructuring, that our resources should serve our people's needs rather than foreign strategic interests. The military partnerships consumed resources, constrained our sovereignty, and provided questionable security benefits. Ending them was essential to achieving genuine independence in security policy. The redirection of $265 million to food security, education, healthcare, and infrastructure represented the positive dimension of budget restructuring. This wasn't simply about cutting military spending, but about investing in what actually provided security and prosperity for our people. The $265 million would be allocated strategically to address the most critical needs and generate the greatest impact on people's lives. The allocation of $120 million to food security programs was the largest single component of redirected spending. Burkina Faso faced chronic food insecurity with approximately 3.4 million people, about 18% of our population, experiencing hunger or malnutrition. The food insecurity resulted from multiple factors, including drought, poor agricultural practices, lack of irrigation, limited access to markets, and poverty. Addressing food insecurity required comprehensive interventions across multiple dimensions. The $120 million for food security would be divided across several programs. We would spend $45 million on emergency food assistance, providing direct food aid to the most vulnerable populations during lean seasons. We would invest $38 million in agricultural development, including improved seeds, fertilizer subsidies, and training in modern farming techniques. We would allocate $23 million to irrigation infrastructure enabling year-round farming. We would use $14 million for rural roads connecting farmers to markets. The emergency food assistance would reach approximately 2.3 million people annually, providing them with sufficient food during the months before harvest when hunger was most severe. The assistance would prevent malnutrition and starvation that claimed lives every year and would enable people to maintain their health and productivity. The immediate impact on reducing suffering would be substantial and visible. The agricultural development investments would increase food production over the long term by helping farmers adopt more productive techniques. The improved seeds would increase yields by 30 to 40% compared to traditional varieties. The fertilizer subsidies would make chemical and organic fertilizers affordable for small farmers who couldn't otherwise access them. The training programs would teach techniques including crop rotation, pest management, and water conservation that would sustainably increase productivity. The irrigation infrastructure would transform agriculture in targeted areas by enabling year-round farming instead of dependence on rainy season. The $23 million would develop irrigation systems serving approximately 45,000 farm families. These families would be able to grow 2 or 3 crops annually instead of one, dramatically increasing their production and incomes. The irrigation would also reduce vulnerability to drought that frequently caused crop failures and hunger. The rural roads would connect farmers to markets where they could sell their products at fair prices. Currently, many farmers in remote areas had no access to markets and either consumed all their production or sold to middlemen at exploitative prices. The roads would enable farmers to transport products to urban markets where prices were higher. The increased incomes would lift families out of poverty and would stimulate rural economic development. The allocation of $78 million to education would address critical shortages in schools, teachers, and educational materials. Burkina Faso had one of the lowest education enrollment rates in Africa, with only 67% of primary-age children attending school and only 34% of secondary-age youth enrolled. The low enrollment resulted from insufficient schools, lack of teachers, poverty that forced children to work, and cultural factors that undervalued education, especially for girls. The $78 million for education would fund multiple initiatives to increase enrollment and improve quality. We would spend $34 million on school construction, building 890 new primary schools in underserved rural areas. We would allocate $23 million to teacher training and recruitment, adding 3,400 new teachers to our education system. We would use $12 million for educational materials, including textbooks, supplies, and equipment. We would spend $9 million on programs to increase girls' enrollment through scholarships and community engagement. The school construction would focus on rural areas where children currently had no access to schools within walking distance. Each new school would serve approximately 300 students from surrounding villages. The 890 schools would provide access to education for 267,000 children who currently couldn't attend because no school was available. The construction would use local materials and labor, creating employment while building infrastructure. The teacher training and recruitment would address the severe shortage of qualified teachers that limited education quality even where schools existed. Many current teachers lacked proper training and taught multiple grades simultaneously in overcrowded classrooms. The 3,400 new teachers would reduce class sizes, improve instruction quality, and enable schools to offer full curriculum. The teachers would receive training in modern pedagogical methods and subject matter expertise. The educational materials would ensure that students and teachers had the books, supplies, and equipment necessary for effective learning. Currently, many schools lacked basic materials, with students sharing textbooks or having none at all. The investment would provide each student with their own textbooks, notebooks, and writing materials. Schools would receive teaching aids, science equipment, and other materials that enabled quality instruction. The programs to increase girls' enrollment would address the gender gap in education, where girls attended school at much lower rates than boys. The scholarships would cover school fees and materials for girls from poor families. The community engagement would work with parents and traditional leaders to build support for girls' education. The programs would aim to achieve gender parity in enrollment within 5 years. The allocation of $45 million to healthcare would strengthen our severely underfunded health system. Burkina Faso had only 5 doctors per 100,000 people, far below the World Health Organization recommendation of 23 per 100,000. We had only 34 hospital beds per 100,000 people compared to recommended levels of 300 per 100,000. Maternal mortality was 320 deaths per 100,000 births, and infant mortality was 52 deaths per 1,000 births. These statistics reflected a health system that couldn't meet basic needs. The $45 million for healthcare would fund critical investments in infrastructure, equipment, and personnel. We would spend $23 million on health clinic construction, building 340 new clinics in underserved areas. We would allocate $12 million to medical equipment for both new and existing facilities. We would use $10 million for health worker training and recruitment. The investments would significantly expand access to healthcare and improve quality of services. The health clinic construction would focus on rural areas where people currently traveled hours to reach the nearest health facility. Each clinic would serve approximately 10,000 people from surrounding communities. The 340 clinics would provide access to basic health care for 3.4 million people who currently had no nearby services. The clinics would offer primary care, maternal and child health services, vaccinations, and treatment for common diseases. The medical equipment would ensure that both new and existing health facilities had the tools necessary to provide quality care. Many current facilities lacked basic equipment, including examination tools, laboratory capabilities, and medical supplies. The investment would equip facilities with essential diagnostic and treatment equipment. The equipment would enable health workers to properly diagnose conditions and provide effective treatment. The health worker training and recruitment would address the severe shortage of doctors, nurses, and other health personnel. We would train 890 new nurses and 340 new community health workers. We would recruit 67 additional doctors through scholarships for medical education. The additional personnel would staff new clinics and strengthen existing facilities. The training would emphasize primary care and public health approaches appropriate for resource-limited settings. The allocation of $22 million to infrastructure would develop critical systems that enabled economic activity and improved quality of life. We would invest in rural roads, irrigation systems, electricity access, and water supply. These infrastructure investments would have multiplier effects by enabling agriculture, commerce, education, and healthcare. The infrastructure would provide foundation for long-term development. The combined impact of these investments in food security, education, healthcare, and infrastructure would be transformative for Burkina Faso. The $265 million redirected from military spending would reach millions of people and would address the most critical barriers to development. The visible improvements in people's lives would build popular support for the government and would create genuine security based on meeting needs rather than on weapons. I proved that sovereignty comes from investing in people rather than buying weapons through the results that followed budget restructuring. Within the first year, food insecurity decreased by 23% as emergency assistance and agricultural development programs reached vulnerable populations. School enrollment increased by 18% as new schools opened and barriers to access were reduced. Healthcare access improved with 340 new clinics serving 3.4 million people. The improvements demonstrated that investing in people provided real security. The proof that investing in people provided better security than buying weapons came from comparing outcomes. During the period of high military spending before budget restructuring, security threats had actually increased despite the weapons we purchased. Armed groups had expanded their operations. Violence had spread to new areas. Populations had become increasingly alienated from government forces whose heavy-handed tactics created resentment. The weapons hadn't provided security. After budget restructuring, security began improving despite reduced military spending. As food security programs reduced hunger and agricultural development increased incomes, populations became less vulnerable to recruitment by armed groups. As schools provided education and opportunity, young people had alternatives to violence. As health clinics improved well-being, communities developed stakes in stability. The social investments addressed root causes of insecurity in ways weapons never could. The transformation in security outcomes validated the fundamental premise of budget restructuring, that genuine security comes from meeting people's needs rather than from weapons. Populations that are fed, educated, healthy, and have economic opportunities support stability and resist armed groups. Populations that are hungry, uneducated, sick, and lack opportunities are vulnerable to recruitment and radicalization. Investing in people builds security while buying weapons often undermines it. Your weapons sales to Africa are declining as more countries follow Burkina Faso's example and restructure budgets to prioritize people over weapons. The decline in weapons sales is accelerating as African countries recognize that military spending drains resources while failing to provide genuine security. The collective shift away from weapons purchases is eliminating billions in revenue for Western and Israeli military industries. The decline in weapons sales to Africa began immediately after Burkina Faso's budget restructuring when other African countries started reassessing their own military spending. Mali announced a 65% reduction in weapons purchases within 2 months. Guinea cut military spending by 58% within 3 months. Niger reduced weapons purchases by 52% within 4 months. The rapid spread of budget restructuring showed that many African countries had been waiting for an example to follow. The collective African shift away from heavy weapons purchases represented a fundamental threat to Western and Israeli military industries that had depended on African markets for substantial revenue. African countries collectively spent approximately $45 billion annually on weapons and military equipment before the restructuring trend began. If spending decreased by 60% across the continent, it would eliminate $27 billion in annual revenue for weapons manufacturers. The $27 billion in lost revenue would devastate certain segments of the military-industrial complex that specialized in African markets. Israeli defense companies that sold surveillance systems, drones, and small arms to African countries faced revenue losses exceeding $3 billion annually. French weapons manufacturers that supplied armored vehicles and aircraft to former colonies faced losses of $5 billion. American companies selling various systems faced losses of $8 billion. The impact was substantial and threatening to these industries. Your military partnerships are ending as African countries terminate training programs, intelligence cooperation, and base access agreements that served your strategic interests rather than our security needs. The ending of military partnerships is eliminating your influence over African security policies and your access to African territory for your military operations. The loss of partnerships is strategic defeat as you lose leverage over African countries. The ending of military partnerships accelerated as African countries recognized that these relationships constrained sovereignty while providing limited security benefits. The training programs that Western militaries provided were often inappropriate for African contexts and sometimes made situations worse. The intelligence cooperation gave Western agencies access to African information while providing minimal reciprocal benefit. The base access agreements allowed Western forces to operate across Africa for their purposes while giving African countries little in return. The termination of French training programs across former French colonies eliminated France's primary tool for maintaining military influence in Africa. France had used training programs to shape African military doctrines, to build relationships with African officers, and to maintain French as the language of military operations. The ending of these programs severed connections that France had maintained since independence and that had been central to French influence in Africa. The cancellation of American intelligence cooperation eliminated U.S. access to information about security situations across Africa. The United States had used intelligence sharing arrangements to gather information for its counterterrorism operations and to monitor various developments across the continent. The ending of cooperation left American agencies with significant intelligence gaps about Africa that would be difficult to fill through other means. The termination of base access agreements forced Western militaries to withdraw from facilities they had used for operations across Africa and the Middle East. France had to close bases in several countries that had been central to its military presence in Africa. The United States lost access to facilities it had used for drone operations and other activities. The loss of access significantly constrained Western military capabilities in the region. Your influence through security cooperation is finished as African countries develop independent security policies that serve our interests rather than yours. The finishing of your influence is liberating as we make security decisions based on our assessment of our needs rather than on your preferences. The independence in security policy is enabling approaches that address root causes of insecurity rather than militarized responses that often make situations worse. The finishing of Western influence through security cooperation was evident in how African countries began approaching security challenges differently after ending military partnerships. Instead of relying on Western advice about counterterrorism and counterinsurgency, African countries developed their own approaches based on understanding local contexts. Instead of using heavy-handed military tactics that Western training had emphasized, African forces began using more nuanced approaches that distinguished between armed groups and populations. The liberation from Western influence enabled African countries to experiment with alternative security approaches that Western military doctrine had discouraged. Countries began emphasizing development and governance improvements as security strategies rather than purely military responses. They began engaging with communities to understand grievances and address them rather than treating all dissent as security threats. They began building local conflict resolution mechanisms rather than imposing security through force. The independence in security policy was producing better outcomes than the Western-influenced approaches had achieved. Security situations were improving in countries that had restructured budgets and ended military partnerships. Armed groups were losing support as populations benefited from social investments. Violence was decreasing as root causes of conflict were addressed. The results validated the alternative approaches and encouraged more countries to adopt them. Your profits from African military spending are disappearing as countries redirect resources from weapons purchases to investments in their people. The disappearing profits are forcing military-industrial companies to downsize, to seek other markets, and to acknowledge that African weapons sales are no longer reliable revenue sources. The loss of African markets is permanent, as countries recognize that investing in people provides better security than buying weapons. The disappearing profits from African military spending were forcing Western and Israeli defense companies to restructure their businesses. Companies that had maintained large operations focused on African markets were closing facilities and laying off workers. Companies that had invested in developing weapon systems specifically for African markets were canceling projects. Companies that had built business models around sustained African sales were searching desperately for alternative revenue sources. Israeli defense companies were particularly hard hit by the loss of African markets. African sales had represented approximately 18% of Israeli defense exports and had been a growing segment. The rapid collapse of African sales forced several Israeli defense companies into financial difficulty. Some companies were acquired by larger competitors. Others were forced to lay off substantial portions of their workforce. The impact on Israel's defense industry was significant. French defense companies faced similar challenges as former colonies ended weapons purchases and military partnerships. African markets had represented approximately 23% of French defense exports. The loss of these markets forced French companies to seek sales elsewhere, but other regions were more competitive and less accessible. The French defense industry faced a permanent contraction as African markets disappeared. American defense companies were somewhat less affected because African markets represented a smaller percentage of their total sales. But even for American companies, the loss of $8 billion in annual African revenue was significant. Companies that had specialized in systems for African markets faced particular difficulties. The loss of African sales contributed to broader challenges facing the American defense industry. Your control is gone as African countries make independent decisions about budget priorities, security policies, and international partnerships without seeking your approval or fearing your retaliation. The loss of control is permanent as African countries recognize that genuine sovereignty requires independence in fundamental decisions about resource allocation and security approaches. The independence is irreversible as populations support governments that prioritize their needs over foreign interests. The loss of Western and Israeli control over African security policies was evident in how African countries responded to pressure to reverse budget restructuring. Western governments applied significant pressure, including threats of aid cuts, warnings about security consequences, and diplomatic isolation. But African countries maintained their restructured budgets because popular support for investing in people over weapons was overwhelming. The pressure failed because populations would not tolerate returning to policies that prioritized foreign profits over their needs. The permanence of lost control came from the transformation in how African populations understood security and sovereignty. People had seen that weapons purchases didn't provide security while social investments did. They had experienced improvements in their lives from redirected resources. They had recognized that military partnerships constrained sovereignty while providing limited benefits. The changed understanding created political pressure that made reversing budget restructuring impossible. The irreversibility of African independence in security policy came from the demonstrated success of alternative approaches. Countries that had restructured budgets and ended military partnerships were achieving better security outcomes than countries maintaining high military spending. The success created incentives for remaining countries to follow the example. The spreading adoption of alternative approaches created momentum that was unstoppable. We have budget priorities that serve our people instead of your profits, with resources allocated to food security, education, healthcare, and infrastructure rather than to weapons that drain resources while failing to provide genuine security. The budget priorities reflect our values and our commitment to our people's well-being rather than to enriching foreign weapons manufacturers. The budget priorities that serve our people are evident in how we allocate every dollar of government spending. Food security receives $120 million to ensure our people have enough to eat. Education receives $78 million to provide opportunities for our children. Healthcare receives $45 million to keep our people healthy. Infrastructure receives $22 million to enable economic development. Military spending receives only $75 million for basic defensive capabilities. The priorities are clear and aligned with our people's needs. The contrast with previous budget priorities that served foreign weapons manufacturers is stark. We had been spending $340 million annually on weapons, more than we spent on food security, education, and healthcare combined. The spending enriched foreign companies while our people went hungry, remained uneducated, and lacked healthcare. The misaligned priorities reflected foreign influence over our budget decisions rather than our own assessment of our needs. The reflection of our values in current budget priorities is important for national identity and pride. Our people see that their government prioritizes their well-being over weapons purchases. They recognize that resources are being used to address their actual needs rather than to benefit foreign companies. They take pride in a government that makes independent decisions serving their interests. The alignment between values and budget priorities strengthens national unity and government legitimacy. We have resources directed to food security instead of weapons, ensuring that our people have enough to eat rather than that foreign weapons manufacturers have profits. The $120 million invested annually in food security is feeding 2.3 million people, supporting 45,000 farm families, and building agricultural systems that will provide food security for generations. The investment is transforming lives and building genuine security. The resources directed to food security are producing visible results that validate the budget restructuring. The emergency food assistance is preventing starvation and malnutrition that had claimed lives every year. The agricultural development programs are increasing food production and farmer incomes. The irrigation infrastructure is enabling year-round farming. The rural roads are connecting farmers to markets. The combined impact is reducing food insecurity dramatically. The transformation in food security is building genuine security in ways that weapons purchases never could. Populations that have enough to eat are less vulnerable to recruitment by armed groups. Communities that see their government addressing their basic needs support stability. Farmers who are earning decent incomes have stakes in peace. The food security is providing foundation for lasting stability and development. We have sovereignty from ending dependencies on your military equipment that required ongoing payments for maintenance, spare parts, and upgrades, while giving you leverage to influence our policies. The sovereignty from ending dependencies is enabling us to make independent decisions about security approaches, international partnerships, and resource allocation without fearing that you will cut off access to equipment we need. The sovereignty from ending dependencies on foreign military equipment is liberating and empowering. We no longer worry that weapons suppliers will refuse to provide spare parts if we take positions they dislike. We no longer fear that maintenance contracts will be canceled if we don't align with supplier countries' foreign policies. We no longer depend on foreign technical expertise that gives suppliers access to our military capabilities and plans. The independence is comprehensive and permanent. The ability to make independent decisions without fearing supplier retaliation is transforming our foreign policy. We can take positions on international issues based on our own interests and values rather than on what weapons suppliers prefer. We can build partnerships with any countries we choose without worrying that weapons suppliers will punish us. We can pursue security approaches that make sense for our context rather than approaches that suppliers promote. The independence is enabling genuine sovereignty. We have genuine security from addressing people's needs through investments in food security, education, healthcare, and infrastructure that build stability by giving populations reasons to support peace rather than through weapons that often make situations worse by militarizing conflicts and alienating populations. The genuine security from addressing people's needs is evident in improving security situations across areas where social investments have been concentrated. Armed groups are losing support as populations benefit from food security programs, education opportunities, healthcare access, and economic development. Violence is decreasing as root causes of conflict including poverty, hunger, lack of opportunity, and poor governance are addressed. The security improvements validate the approach of investing in people rather than weapons. The contrast with the insecurity that persisted despite high military spending is instructive. When we were spending $340 million annually on weapons, security situations were deteriorating. Armed groups were expanding operations. Violence was spreading to new areas. Populations were becoming increasingly alienated from government forces. The weapons weren't providing security because they didn't address the root causes of conflict. The validation of investing in people as security strategy is encouraging more African countries to adopt similar approaches. Countries are recognizing that genuine security comes from meeting populations' needs rather than from accumulating weapons. They are restructuring their own budgets to prioritize social investments over military spending. They are achieving better security outcomes than they had achieved through militarized approaches. The spreading adoption is transforming African security policies comprehensively. We have victory over your military-industrial exploitation that drained our resources for decades, while providing questionable security benefits and constraining our sovereignty through dependencies and partnerships that served your interests over ours. The victory over military-industrial exploitation is comprehensive and permanent. We have ended the weapons purchases that drained our resources. We have terminated the military partnerships that constrained our sovereignty. We have eliminated the dependencies that gave foreign powers leverage over our policies. We have redirected resources to investments that actually serve our people's needs. The victory is complete across all dimensions of the exploitative relationship. The transformation is spreading as all 54 African nations restructure budgets to prioritize sovereignty over oppression and people's needs over weapons purchases. Your era is finished. Our time is beginning. The change is irreversible. The future belongs to Africa that invests in populations rather than weapons, that chooses sovereignty over military dependencies, and that funds dignity instead of complicity in your wars. The spreading transformation across Africa is accelerating as more countries recognize the benefits of restructured budgets and alternative security approaches. The 54 African nations are at various stages of restructuring, but the direction is clear and consistent. Military spending is decreasing, social investments are increasing, security outcomes are improving. The transformation is becoming universal across the continent. Your era of profiting from African military spending while constraining our sovereignty through weapons dependencies and military partnerships is finished. The era lasted 60 years from independence until now, but it is ending as African countries recognize that genuine security comes from investing in people rather than buying weapons. The ending is permanent as populations will not tolerate returning to policies that prioritized foreign profits over their needs. Our time of investing in our people and building genuine security through addressing their needs is beginning. This new era will be characterized by budget priorities that reflect our values, security approaches that address root causes of conflict, and sovereignty that enables independent decision-making. Our time will produce the development and prosperity that 60 years of military spending failed to deliver. The change is irreversible because the knowledge and experience that produced it cannot be erased. African populations have seen that investing in people provides better security than buying weapons. They have experienced improvements in their lives from redirected resources. They have recognized that military partnerships constrain sovereignty while providing limited benefits. The knowledge will persist and will prevent any return to previous policies. The future belongs to Africa that invests in populations rather than weapons because that is the only path to genuine security and development. Countries that continue spending heavily on weapons while their people lack food, education, and health care will face continued insecurity and underdevelopment. Countries that invest in people will build stability and prosperity. The future will belong to those who choose wisely. I proved it works by restructuring Burkina Faso's budget and achieving better security through social investment than through weapons. The proof is visible in reduced food insecurity, increased school enrollment, improved healthcare access, and better security outcomes. The proof is undeniable and is inspiring other countries to follow our example. Other African nations are proving it by following our example and redirecting resources from weapons to their people's needs. Mali, Guinea, Niger, and many others have restructured their budgets and are achieving similar results. The collective African experience is demonstrating that investing in people provides better security than buying weapons. The proof is becoming overwhelming. The following of our example by other African nations has been rapid and comprehensive, demonstrating that Burkina Faso's budget restructuring tapped into widespread frustration with military spending that drained resources while failing to provide genuine security. Within months of our announcement, multiple countries had begun their own restructuring processes. Within a year, the majority of African countries had reduced military spending and redirected resources to social investments. The continental transformation was unprecedented in speed and scope. Mali's budget restructuring was announced just 2 months after ours and was similarly dramatic. They reduced military equipment spending by 65%, from $280 million annually to $98 million. The $182 million saved was redirected to agriculture, education, and healthcare. Mali's government explicitly cited Burkina Faso's example as inspiration and adopted similar principles about prioritizing people's needs over weapons purchases. The rapid adoption showed that our example had resonated deeply. The results in Mali validated the approach within the first year. Agricultural investments increased food production by 28% as farmers received improved seeds, fertilizer support, and irrigation infrastructure. School enrollment increased by 22% as new schools opened in underserved areas and barriers to access were reduced. Healthcare access improved dramatically with 230 new clinics serving 2.3 million people. Security situations improved as populations benefited from social investments and became less vulnerable to recruitment by armed groups. Guinea's restructuring followed 3 months after ours with a 58% reduction in military spending, from $190 million to $80 million. The $110 million saved was invested in mining sector reform, infrastructure development, and social services. Guinea's approach demonstrated that budget restructuring could be adapted to different national contexts while maintaining the core principle of prioritizing people over weapons. The flexibility made the model applicable across diverse African countries. Guinea's results were similarly positive within the first year. Mining sector reforms increased government revenues by 34% as contracts were renegotiated to ensure fair terms. Infrastructure investments connected previously isolated regions to national markets, stimulating economic activity. Social service improvements, including new schools and health clinics, reached 1.8 million people. The comprehensive benefits built popular support for the restructuring and made reversal politically impossible. Niger's budget restructuring was announced 4 months after ours with a 52% reduction in military spending from $160 million to $77 million. The $83 million saved was directed to food security programs, rural development, and education. Niger's government emphasized that the restructuring reflected their commitment to addressing people's actual needs rather than accumulating weapons that didn't provide genuine security. The clear articulation of principles helped build public understanding and support. Niger's results showed particular success in food security where targeted investments produced rapid improvements. Emergency food assistance reached 1.9 million people during lean seasons, preventing malnutrition and starvation. Agricultural development programs increased crop yields by 31% through improved seeds and techniques. Irrigation infrastructure enabled year-round farming for 28,000 families. The food security improvements reduced vulnerability to armed groups and built stability. The spreading of budget restructuring beyond these initial countries demonstrated that the approach was becoming standard African practice rather than isolated experiments. By the end of the first year, 23 African countries had announced significant reductions in military spending with resources redirected to social investments. By the end of the second year, 38 countries had restructured budgets. The momentum was building toward universal African adoption. The collective African experience across these countries was providing overwhelming evidence that investing in people provided better security than buying weapons. Every country that restructured budgets reported improvements in food security, education, healthcare, and economic development. Every country reported better security outcomes as populations benefited from social investments. Every country reported increased popular support for governments that prioritize people's needs. The consistency of results across diverse contexts proved the approach's validity. The demonstration that investing in people provides better security was particularly important because it challenged conventional wisdom that had dominated security thinking for decades. Military establishments and Western advisors had long argued that security required substantial weapons purchases and that reducing military spending would make countries vulnerable. The African experience proved this conventional wisdom wrong by showing that social investments provided better security than weapons. The proof becoming overwhelming was forcing even skeptics to acknowledge that budget restructuring was producing superior outcomes. International organizations that had previously emphasized military solutions to security challenges began recognizing the value of addressing root causes through development. Academic researchers studying African security were documenting the success of alternative approaches. Media coverage was highlighting the positive results of budget restructuring. The accumulating evidence was becoming impossible to ignore or dismiss. African sovereignty guarantees everything because independent we control our own priorities, and determined we invest in our people, and principled we refuse to fund your oppression, and nothing can prevent us from choosing our people over your profits and building prosperous, secure Africa through investing in populations instead of buying weapons that serve your interests instead of ours forever. The guarantee that African sovereignty provides comes from our complete control over our own priorities without needing approval from foreign powers or fearing their retaliation. We decide how to allocate our resources based on our assessment of our people's needs. We choose our security approaches based on what works in our contexts. We build partnerships based on our interests rather than on foreign pressure. The independence in decision making is the essence of sovereignty and is the foundation for everything else we want to achieve. The control over our own priorities means that we can structure budgets to reflect our values rather than foreign interests. We can prioritize food security over weapons purchases because we recognize that hungry people cannot be secure. We can invest in education over military equipment because we understand that educated populations build prosperous societies. We can fund healthcare over weapon systems because we know that healthy people are productive and stable. The alignment between our priorities and our values is only possible when we control our own decisions. The determination to invest in our people comes from understanding that our people are our greatest resource and that investing in them provides the highest returns. Every dollar spent on food security, education, healthcare, or infrastructure generates benefits that compound over time. Fed children grow into productive adults. Educated youth create innovations and enterprises. Healthy populations work and contribute. Infrastructure enables economic activity. The investments in people build foundations for long-term prosperity. The principle of refusing to fund oppression reflects our commitment to justice and our recognition that complicity in crimes against humanity is unacceptable. We will not purchase weapons from countries using similar weapons to commit genocide. We will not maintain military partnerships with countries whose forces violate human rights. We will not allocate our scarce resources to enriching those who profit from oppression. The principled stance is non-negotiable because our integrity and moral standing depend on it. The impossibility of preventing us from choosing our people over foreign profits comes from the strength of popular support for policies that serve our interests. Our populations have experienced the benefits of budget restructuring through improved food security, better education, enhanced healthcare, and economic development. They recognize that these improvements came from redirecting resources away from weapons purchases. They will not tolerate any return to policies that prioritized foreign profits over their needs. The popular support makes our choices irreversible. The building of prosperous, secure Africa through investing in populations is our ultimate goal and is becoming our reality. The prosperity comes from economic development enabled by infrastructure, educated workforces, healthy populations, and food security. The security comes from stability built on meeting people's needs rather than on weapons. The combination of prosperity and security is creating the Africa we deserve, free from foreign exploitation, independent in our decisions, and committed to our people's well-being.